in ways that you never thought possible when you're just thinking about how can I take, take, take. You need to flip that of how can I give, give, give? How can I give value to that person? And you never will know. I mean, you'll be so surprised at what happens as a result of that. But I like to think of it as I get paid to listen for a living. And I think I'm a very good active listener. And I want to understand, what are your business pains? What's your why? Because products don't solve problems. Products don't close deals. Features don't close deals. Business problems do. It's not what can I give you? It's not why should you use my product? It's what is your business problem and pain? And if that's something I can solve for, great, let's figure that out. But the first step is figuring out, is this actually a problem that you care about?
You cannot believe, even if you didn't start this community, totally different future, right? It's life-changing, game-changing, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it's been a game changer for everything. I think, you just get such a big superpower by having a community behind you and a community that you can reach out to if you need help. If I needed to find, I don't know, take even something that isn't work related. If I need to find a subletter tomorrow or I don't even know what an example would be. If I was trying to find an event or I needed a space or, I wanted dinner recommendations, I can go and ask my community, which is just really cool. So it's a superpower for everything. And if I decide to start a company tomorrow and I needed help, I know I could reach out to the community.
This is awesome. So speaking of community building, it's your superpower. That's why you gathered tons of wonderful people and also you found sponsor. So what do you think? Your superpower to attract people, to grab people's heart is nature or nurture?
I really want to say both. I'll go with nurture. And the reason is nature only gets you so far. You could have, let's say you're a big name out there, I don't know, let's say you're Alex Hermosi, you're Alex Lieberman, you're someone who has 1 million followers and a big brand behind you, so-called. No one actually knows you personally. So if, you have a large following and you said, I'm going to host an event tomorrow, you could realistically get a lot of people to show up. But if you suck as a person or you curate really bad vibes there and people don't leave that event feeling like it's something they want to come back to or you're someone they want to spend their time professionally with, then it doesn't matter what the nature is because the nurture isn't there. So I think you need to pull and play into that emotional side of it and create a nature that's long lasting to be able to nurture people.
Is this your parent education? To care of people? How can I help you a kind of giver? This mindset is, how did you get it?
I think I'm lucky that I was for sure born with it. I'm just a naturally curious person. But I think I've just especially living in New York, you see such a diversity of people, of opinions, of thought, of just the way that people interact with the world. And when I have, gone traveling and seen different countries, I think it just gives you this openness to seeing what people care about. And you kind of flip this mindset of how can I take versus how can I give? And I heard that on a podcast the other day. It's not what people can do for you. It's what can you do for people. And so when you listen to people and you try to naturally help them and you're always thinking of how can I help that person, people will naturally want to give to you. And it will just help you so far and advance you so far into your career and the things that you actually want to happen in ways that you never thought possible when you're just thinking about how can I take, take, take. You need to flip that of how can I give, give, give? How can I give value to that person? And you never will know. I mean, you'll be so surprised at what happens as a result of that. People always say, oh, you work in sales, so you must be really good at talking. Like you get paid to talk for a living. And I always go, I mean, yeah, that is a part of it, but I like to think of it as I get paid to listen for a living. And I think I'm a very good active listener. And I want to understand, what are your business pains? What's your why? Because products don't solve problems. Products don't close deals. Features don't close deals. Business problems do. It's not what can I give you? It's not why should you use my product? It's what is your business problem and pain? And if that's something I can solve for, great. Let's figure that out. But the first step is figuring out, is this actually a problem that you care about? And is this something that's worthy of your budget that enough people in your organization care about, that you're really motivated to fix this? If so, let's figure out what the best solution is, whether that's us, whether that's somebody else, whether that's X thing. But step one is you have to understand and be confident that you can actually help the people, as opposed to just jamming products down people's, throats, which is why I think people naturally don't like salespeople.
Thank you. This is a great tips for early stage founders. I know many founders, they are good at to build, they are good at to create, but they are struggling to get paid customers. So it's amazing tip.
Yeah, I actually, I coach and I talk to founders almost every single day. And
You do coaching.
Yeah. Yep, on the side. So I coach early stage founders with this exact problem. And it's, it's not their fault. I don't blame them. Like if you've never been trained in sales and you don't have a sales background, it's really, really hard to sell. Like sales is the hardest profession out there. And I stand by that, besides like a surgeon. But like it's really hard and it's way harder than you think. It's always an art that you're working towards. And I think the problem a lot of early stage founders get wrong is they think if I build the best product out there, people will come to it. I'll build a product so good that any salesperson can sell it. And while there's an element of that that's true, you have to have an actually good product. The reality is you need to first listen to your customers. You need to listen to those people who have the pain point. You need to understand, what are the things that keep them up at night? What are the things that, they complain to their spouse about? What are the things that stress them? What are the things that like they're freaking out about before they go to bed? What are the things that, they're thinking about in the shower? Those are the pain points that you want to solve towards. And you want to understand the people as opposed to just thinking, oh, if I just build this feature, if I just build this product, like everyone's going to want it. Maybe, maybe not, but have you gone out and done the research? Have you talked to your buyers? Have you really taken the time to understand them and ask those deep questions? Have you watched them use the product? And that's how you build a truly successful product. Because sales should ultimately, at the end of the day, be a collaborative effort where both people walk away from the table going, wow, this is really beneficial to me. And this is going to solve my pain point.
Yeah, thank you. It's amazing. Okay, so maybe our audience want to get your coaching. So how can we reach out to you via LinkedIn?
Yeah. You can email me, skylerbirk@gmail.com. If you want to talk about Notion or low code or no code, you can find me there. I'm on LinkedIn. I post literally every single day, and I have over the past year and a half. I'm hopefully going to start building on other social platforms, but for now, do that. And if you ever want to practice your sales skills, you can text or call me, cold FaceTime me anytime, 503-880-7397. I put this on anytime I talk to anyone, and only one person has ever taken me up on it.
Thank you so much. Last two questions. Sorry. I have a lot.
That's okay.
Thank you. So speaking of LinkedIn, so you have like 10,000 followers on LinkedIn, right? So tell us about this story.
So it's an interesting one. So ever since I got into sales, I've always wanted to, I call it rig the game in my advantage. I want to do everything that's humanly possible to make it so that they're going to think about me as opposed to my competitors, so that I don't have to work as hard. I want to play the game on easy mode while everyone else is playing the game on hard mode. That's not to say I don't want to work hard, but I just want to work smarter. So I've always thought, people use LinkedIn wrong.
Okay.
Everyone uses LinkedIn wrong.
Okay.
LinkedIn can be your most powerful tool. It can be your entire marketing strategy if you do it right. Not to say I necessarily do it right, but when I first started, I just kept thinking, cool, I can use ChatGPT. I can use AI to write all my LinkedIn posts. And you go on LinkedIn right now. I read something recently that over 50% of posts are AI generated. Just because you can do something with AI doesn't mean that you should. So I tried to build an audience on LinkedIn twice. Both times they failed massively because I was just writing AI. I call it AI slop. It's just garbage. It's not me. And I have a very authentic voice, just like everyone does. And you have interesting things to say. And you should play into that. So I started thinking, okay, no AI at all. I'm going to write every single word myself. And I sat down and I said, oh my God, this is hard. I'm going to post every single day. So I said, okay, for the next 6 months, I am going to post, and I literally wrote it on a whiteboard. I'm going to post every day on LinkedIn. No ifs, ands, or buts. No excuses. I don't know what's going to happen. I may get 0 likes. I may get 5 followers. My mom might be the only one who likes my post. Who cares? I'm going to do it every single day for 6 months without fail, and let's see what happens. And for the first probably 3 or 4 months, that I was getting, 2 or 3 likes a post. It was going nowhere. And I was like, oh, this is going to fail. But I said, I have to keep going. Then around month 4, someone reached out to me. They DM'd me and they said, hey, I saw one of your videos about Notion. We have that exact pain point. I'm introducing you to our head of RevOps. They need to talk to you. We want to work together. And I went, no shit, this is working. Here's the crazy thing. Anyone who's thinking about building an audience on social media should think about this. I looked back. He never liked one of my posts. He never interacted with my post. For all I know, he's never even seen one of my posts. You never know who's watching. And so he was watching. He was reading my posts. He was watching my videos, but he wasn't interacting. But he was the exact person I wanted to talk to at the exact right time. And he reached out. Less than a month later, the deal was closed, and they're still an active client of ours. And so you never know who's watching when you put yourself out there. It always feels like, oh, I should be moving faster. Oh, I should be getting more likes. Oh, I should be getting more impressions. This is a waste of time. I should stop. But you never know. And all it takes is one to really make it worth it. And then, from there, I said, well, I can't ever stop now. So now, here we are a year and a half later with, like 11,000 followers. People are reaching out, at least once a week, someone reaches out to me about Notion, about, advice, about who knows what. And, I just know that if I keep going, it'll grow to 15,000, 20,000 followers. But it doesn't even, the follower count doesn't matter to me. It's just that I know that, even if they don't like that people are listening to what I have to say, which feels weird, but that I can ask them for help, that people look at me like I'm a thought leader, and, you can use it as an entire marketing strategy.
This is awesome. Like Jacob.
Yeah. And I know it's only going to keep, as time goes on, as I keep getting better at writing, it's only going to keep going up and up. So, if I ever start a company, I'm going to have an audience that already follows me, that already listens to me, that already knows me, that I can speak directly to. So I'll have that advantage that you wouldn't have if you weren't posting content.
And as you mentioned, I agreed. Many people have misunderstanding of LinkedIn. LinkedIn is not only just a job board.
Yep.
Because thanks to LinkedIn, I found this genius person, Skyler, right? So
Exactly.
yeah. And then so my podcast is only just YouTube. So from the YouTube, I don't get any direct message. But through the LinkedIn, hey, I watched this episode. So blah blah blah. Could you please introduce this person? Conversation is happening. Yeah, it's amazing.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's super powerful. I mean, I think, sure, you can use it for jobs. Sure, you should use it for jobs, but it's so much more. I mean, to any recruiters out there, just to clarify, I'm very happy. Don't reach out. But I get recruiters in my DMs, at least once a week. Like it is a good thing to know that like if nothing's going to happen, optimization, we're killing it. But if, I needed a job tomorrow, I could rely on the fact that I already have a, social media presence. I already have a brand behind me that like I already have people who want to hire me because they feel like they know me just because I'm posting content every time.
Maybe we could propose LinkedIn, like some workshop or small talk event.
Totally.
Yeah, because
LinkedIn, hit me up.
yeah, please.
I have so many ways to fix the product. We're getting rid of all the AI generated comments. They drive me crazy. They drive everyone crazy. They're ruining the platform. But I have a lot of things we can help. Hit me up.
Yeah, let's do it. Yay. So, okay, last question. So, do you have any pain point currently? If you have, please let us know. Our audience could help you, or I also could help you.
Yeah. So, well, number one, if you need Notion help, no code, low code, or you're an early stage founder that needs coaching or sales help, hit me up. Let's talk. If you want to sponsor Tech Pickleball, you want to do something really, really fun and creative, hit me up. Let's talk. The pain point that I have is a weird one because it's not really a pain point. I'm a very happy person. My life couldn't be better. I don't have anything that I can complain about. But I'm a builder. I'm what they call a wantrepreneur. I really want to build something on the side, and I've been learning how to vibe code. I've never been someone who's interested in engineering or like writing code, but now it's easier than it ever is. I don't know what to build. I have no idea what I want to build or what the pain point I want to solve for is. And every time, it's like the opposite. Like other people, they know what they want to build and they know what they want to do and they know what company they want to build. They just don't know how to build it or how to build it effectively. I'm the opposite. I think I have the skills. I know I have the drive. I have the community behind it to build something epic. I just literally, every time I sit down and try to like build it, I'm like, I don't know what to build. So if you ever have any ideas for something that, you're not an entrepreneur, but you have an idea in the world that you want solved, that you wish someone else would build, hit me up. I'll give you 5% of the company, 5% of the side hustle, whatever it is, just to take your idea. You literally don't have to do anything else. And if I use your idea, I'll build it and give you a nice little 5%.
I have an idea. Maybe like the end of the year or at some point, if you have time, why not we can host like just 2 hours pitch contest. Because of a genius salesperson who does community building. And I do media and I have community in Japan, Silicon Valley. So maybe it's...
I'm in. Let's do it. Pitch competition.
Okay, we gonna maybe host event in this year. Okay, please stay tuned. Yes.
But you have to pitch while you're playing pickleball. And you only, Alex Lieberman Morning Brew style, where you only get 60 seconds to pitch your startup. We'll do it, but you only get as long as the pickleball rally goes to pitch your startup.
I see. Please prepare to make muscle and please come to the venue earlier before like 7:30 or maybe 7.
Exactly. It'll be fun.
Thank you so much. Wonderful conversation today, Skyler.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you for having me on. This was super fun.
The 3 key takeaways from the conversation with Skyler. Part 2. 1. Community is the real superpower. Skyler built a 1,500-person Tech Pickleball community, not with arrows or cold emails, but with trust and generosity. Whenever he needs help, finding an event space, a subletter, or even business feedback, his community shows up. Community gives you unfair advantage in work and life. Start building it before you need it. Okay? Takeaway 2. Sales is about listening, not pitching. As a coach for early stage founders, Skyler says, I don't get paid to talk. He focuses on understanding business pain points, not pushing futures. That's why clients trust him. Lesson: Stop selling. Start solving real problems by asking better questions. Takeaway 3. Consistency plus authenticity beats AI Slop. Skyler posted on LinkedIn every day for 6 months without AI tool. The first few months were quiet, but then one silent follower reached out and became a paying client. You never know who's watching. One post can change everything if it's real and consistent. Amazing, right? Okay, thank you so much for watching our episode today. We hope today's conversation will help your future and career. If you like it, please subscribe us and give it a like. Okay, thank you so much. Bye bye. またね。チャオ